Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Ribbons of Rust, The Beatles Recording History and Context, Volume 1, July 1954 through January 1963. It might just be one of the great Beatles books titles in a very long time. And it immediately tells you this isn't like anything else that we've had before. It seems very specific. Could we unpack before we dive into the book itself? I'm just fascinated by the fact that you are each highly respected Beatles authors, known for your respective forensic focus and detail. This seems like a perfect union. I'm just curious how long you've been aware of each other and what prompted this concept.
I can tell a bit of the story. I met Robert back at a Beatles Fest in, I want to say it was Chicago, that I was working for my first book. And I was aware of Robert because his work on Revolver was part of the research that I did in building my books, and completely intimidated by him, like really intimidated. And my wife, who is not intimidated by anybody, said, just go talk to him. Just go say hi. So I go over and he's got his head buried. I think he was working on a Satby edit or something. And he kind of looks up and you know, I got the time of day, but only a little time of day. But but that was kind of the initial like breaking of the ice. And then we were kind of at that fest event, we were kind of next to each other. So we just started talking and had a wonderful, initial, meet. And Roberts just turns out to be just a fantastic guy, and all of the fear fell off of me, and we've just, we've hit it off over the years. And when I was looking at something to do next, it really occurred to me that there was kind of a missing component with the work that I had already done. And as you mentioned, it's kind of forensic. It was just focused on the recording aspect. But I had yet to see anything out there that really kind of tied the story of the Beatles in their time to the work in the studio. And so I got a hold of Robert and just kind of we bounced a bunch of ideas back and forth, and together we kind of came into this concept that became Ribbons of Rust, where the idea is to explore the Beatles' influences and how they found their way into their work, and then post the work being done, of course, then that influence carries on the Beatles through time. So the idea of all these books is where these ideas germinated with the Beatles, how they manifested themselves in the work they did, and then on the back end of it, how that work that they did then ended up, they became the influencers for generations. So that's the whole of the arc of these books, and starting with the prehistory, which Robert did the yeoman's work on. So I'll let him talk a little bit more about that.
Please, yeah.
My friend came to me with sadness in his eyes.
Here we go.
Told me that he had this title, but no book to go with it. Ribbons of Rust. So it's like, okay, well, I hope we could live up to that. So once the concept was formed, it's like, okay, so what we made our focus, and it was a very well delineated division of labor, because Jerry is, of course, the expert on everything going on in the studio, everything from what compressor, what limiter, what microphone, what mic stand they used, to how the stuff was all laid out on the multi-track tapes. And that's like, for all the years I've been doing this, that was one thing that I love having the information, but I've never dove into it to that degree. So, good on you, brother. So my interest tended to lie in the history, the cultural history, the music history going on. And I've always been well into the ephemera of stuff, the periodicals, the stuff that documents this before it was history as it's actually happening. So it seemed a really good match of interests and skill sets. And I, as I do with other books I've written, started with a timeline. And that sort of suggested, well, if we really want to trace back to the roots of what put them on the path to first becoming musicians and then wanting to make records, you have to start in the summer of 54, because that's when this big confluence of things happened that put a generation of kids on the path that manifested in the 60s as these great recording artists, but the Beatles in particular, who, as we well know, are so singular. So that was kind of how we got this going. And it's like any other project I've been in. You start out having a certain set of preconceived notions, but then as you start assembling the data, thesis starts to emerge. And it's like, okay, you thought you knew this history and you kind of know the general outlines, but there's so much more to it. So really the purpose of this book and this series is to sort of fill in the cracks and portray the Beatles' journey within the world going on around them. We feel, in short, if we did our job right, the reader will be placed into 1950s, early 60s Britain and Hamburg, both with the use of the heavy use of the visuals, as well as the QR codes that take you, as you're reading, you can hear then what we're describing. It'll link you to that music or that bit of film or whatever. So that was really what we wanted to do, is put them back into the world they inhabited as this music came into being.
The QR code element you mentioned is a wonderful innovation in Beatle authorship, and I'd like to unpack that a little bit, but just to go back for a moment, I remember hearing you say something recently, Robert, about, and I agreed, that pre-63, 64, for a lot of fans, there's this idea that everything was black and white. It was a dry kind of post-war bleakness. And then suddenly the lights came on. But that wasn't the case. And I think that seems to be a key part of what you're each trying to do here, is have us understand that this is also a very vibrant time, that there was this incredible explosion of rock, and the book seems to make a very concerted effort to drive home the point. This was a period of color.
Very much so, and very dynamic and exciting. These songs, when you listen to, like, say, the BBC sets, or some of the stuff that we knew that made it onto their album tracks, especially the first two albums, these girl groups, these Motown acts, these early, Chuck Berry, Carl Perkins, things like that. These were new records when they were getting into them and then putting them into their set list on stage. This was all new stuff. It wasn't oldies then. It wasn't arcane. This was like cutting edge, raw, exciting stuff. Very much at a time when rock and roll was frowned upon. It was associated with violence and the Teds in England and all that stuff. It was hard to get them into the cavern, as we know, because it was one thing to be skiffle, because that was considered to be sort of an offshoot of jazz, and jazz was respectable. But knock off the bloody rock was the direction that got directly from the manager of the cavern. But they were true believers in this stuff. They were on a mission. Long as after the pop scene had sort of morphed into this producer's medium of pretty boy singers, the Johnny Gentles and the Adam Fates and all that stuff, they were still in their full leather and just playing this raucous stuff on stage. I mean, it very much is a precursor to punk when you look at what was going on in England mid-70s. That was the Beatles world, and that was kind of how they were regarded. They were this raw, around the edges, hard-edged band with the Adam beat.
I agree with you completely. I had the wonderful opportunity last week to speak with Sir Bob Geldof about the impact of the band on him, and he made a very similar comment that these guys were the original punks. And when he was a young boy, 11 years of age, and living in struggle town, that spoke to him. This idea that you could do this thing, you could be anything you want to be, you just have to push against. And that seemed to be very much informed into the Fab Four at this time, well, even pre-Ringo, but that seemed to be going on for them at a very early age, didn't it? This idea of pushing against.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you... Go ahead, Jerry, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say there was always ambition there. There was always that, there was always the striving and the want for more within the Beatles, and they weren't afraid of the work that was required to do that. A little directionless at first, like all kids are, but it didn't take them very long to kind of to line up and start achieving their goals. I mean, they wanted to be on record, and very early, there they are in Percy Phillips' studio, when they can play a little bit, but they're already cutting a record because that's what they're after.
And that's a serious investment for these underfunded kids. It wasn't as if they had the specific goal of, say, a Billy Fury. We're going to demo our original material, then shop it to a successful artist who's looking for material. They didn't have that manifested yet. It was more about, let's see what we sound like. George had just mastered the opening of That'll Be the Day, which it took them forever to crack that code till they figured out he was playing it with a capo on his neck. And then they've got this original tune in their pocket as well. So it really seemed to be their motivations very early on. We want to make records, but let's assess ourselves along the way. And as we point out in the book, at every juncture they had to get themselves on tape, original material is always part of the mix. And that was something that if they were realists, knowing that if you get so lucky as to get a record deal and a recording contract, you're not going to be in position to dictate anything coming in the door. You are going to record what they deem is commercial, and we're going to get hit records out of this. Yet that was their demand. We want a record deal, but it has to be on these terms, or else we're not interested.
Yeah, great point. I know, Jerry, you come from a mix engineer background and a very successful career in that. I wondered, particularly then from the perspective of studio design and music engineering, can we talk about Percy Phillips and this, I guess it was a ramshackle studio operating in the heart of Liverpool. His story alone, if you pulled that out and opened it up, sounds amazing.
Yeah, so Percy Phillips had a little electrical repair shop in Kensington. Is that correct, Robert? Yeah. And looked at this side business of making personal records for people. Acquired the equipment, which was this master sound system rig that included a disc cutter, so a disc cutting lathe where you could record direct to disc. For people with a little bit more money, there was also a quarter-inch reel-to-reel tape machine that you could record to first and get it perfect before you cut it to disc. And it was just very simple. A couple of microphones, an HMV microphone and a Reslo, both ribbon microphones, but a very rudimentary setup. However, good enough to document the moment and good enough to document people that were working in show business. Ken Dodd recorded at Percy Phillips' studio, and Dodd had a successful show business career. So he just put a room aside that that they had a piano in and had the recording gear in and room enough to get a handful of people in. And that was, that's the studio. He had a little reverb setup that was a kind of a tub that was turned over on itself with a speaker thrown into it, and just so rudimentary. But it did the job for what he was trying to do, to make just make these personal recordings. There's never much thought that they'd be anything beyond that, but people documenting family events or the love letters, the audio love letters and things like that. But people like the Beatles, acts like the Beatles, found it as a great introduction for themselves to have that record, to make that recording.
Yeah.
And that was their start. Interestingly enough, it comes up in the book, and I'll let Robert tell tell the story. We all know about the initial recordings that were made at the Phillips studio. That'll Be the Day, and In Spite of All the Danger. But we learned through discussions with Peter Phillips, with one of the Percy's grandson, about some other stuff going on. I'll let Robert tell that story.
Yeah, it was something that until we did the research for this book, I'd seen it as asides here and there, and you never know what to take seriously in the absence of any actual physical evidence. And in this case, number one, there was no actual acetate known to exist. And number two, no existing Percy Phillips studio logbook. But I'd seen a quote from Arthur Kelly, who we know was a friend of George's and was in sort of the Quarrymen circle in those days, that he remembered another recording they did at Percy Phillips of, wait for it, One After 909, a song that bookends the Beatles' career. They do it at Forthland Road on those tapes at Paul's house in the spring of 1960. And then, of course, on the rooftop when, after that false start at EMI in 63, they finally nail it. So it's a song that just runs the gamut of their career. Yeah. And I later, in doing the research, I found that Paul confirmed as much as, yes, we did record One After 909. Nobody knew where it existed. So finally we were thinking, well, surely the Phillips family would know if this really happened. And it was through Jerry's relationship with Peter Phillips that we were able to confirm, yes, it did happen. There was a second Quarrymen session, and no, the logbook for 1960 is missing. But we believe it happened in January 1960, just before Stuart Sutcliffe came into the band.
That's remarkable. What a great find.
That's sort of.
But you know what? Every day it seems like there's new recordings surfacing that nobody even knew existed. Just in the past month, 2 live shows from 1963. One where they were the opening act for Orbison, and then another one later that summer when they were the headliners, and I think Billy J. Kramer and somebody else was the support for them. And they're decent recordings of the Beatles live on stage at a period that we didn't know existed till this year. So, there's hope. Maybe someday somebody will find this unlabeled disc, put it on. It's Beatles doing One After 909. So,
yeah.
It could happen.
That's wonderful. It's almost like a story that reads preordained the more you dig in, doesn't it? I mean, it really is quite remarkable.
If you want to regard July 7th, 1957 as the big bang of 60s culture, the day that John and Paul are formally introduced, and then you discover, well, not only were the Quarrymen photographed that day, but somebody brought their reel-to-reel down to record their set that very day. It's like, if you kept it running when Paul's playing 20 Flight Rock, how remarkable would that have been? But what we have is plenty remarkable.
Who in their right mind packs up a reel-to-reel and heads down to the local school fete to do something like that? Just that idea is remarkable.
Yeah, these things are cinder blocks. It's not like, a little Walkman or something. It takes some effort.
Can we stay in that space for a little while and just talk about that day in that studio in 1958? Who's there and what takes place inside that space?
Good, Robert.
Well, it's the 5 Quarrymen that day. And this is something else that came up in the research, because when they put the blue plaque out there to make it a landmark that this is where the Quarrymen did their first recording, they got the date wrong. And that led everybody to question when the surviving members of the Quarrymen, Duff Lowe, who played piano, and Colin Hatton recalled that session. They said that it was a cold day. They remember wearing, a jacket or something, or a scarf. And so we were thinking, wow, was July completely wrong? So we looked into it. And sure enough, the Percy Phillips logbooks had an unnamed skiffle group recording exactly as we know they did, direct to disc, on July 12th, the Saturday in 1958. So then I checked the weather. Sure enough, it was an unseasonably cold day in July. So it all fit their memories as well as what the documentation showed. So it's things like that you read about these things, and there's been so much bad information passed along in Beatle history. We hope to take those extra steps to confirm one way or another that which is knowable versus that which is unknowable.
Where did the inspiration come for this wonderful idea of immersion and interactivity with the book, with the QR codes and the links to vision and sound? That itself is a step forward in what we're used to in terms of Beatle books. I'm curious where that came from.
Well,
I mean,
Robert,
it's out there. Yeah, people have
yeah,
done it,
yeah,
but
yeah.
as far as
Robert
Beatle
had
books
the
go,
idea to
is where
bring
they're
this.
so dependent on visuals and sound. It made good sense as an idea. Like, how do we differentiate this book from the 10,000 other books out there?
Yeah.
Well, and not only that, but back to this idea that the Beatles were not, living in a black and white world. It wasn't it uh, and the way that you drive that home is to give people that experience. But we also, it's not only the music that we're bringing to light for people so they can understand the excitement that the Beatles were hearing, but we also are tapping on documentaries from British Pathé, for instance. So you really get a feel of like what was going on when rationing ended, when these new opportunities economically were coming to the youth of Britain, and all of these things bring the world alive. There's a tendency to let the rest of the world fall away when you're talking about the Beatles, because within the fullness of time, you think they were it, they were everything, but they were always just a piece of the world. They were always just a piece of the culture, and we wanted to frame them in a way that was kind of undeniable for people reading. They could hear as well as we hear, with all of our exposure to it, where the Beatles are starting to germinate these ideas that start to come into their music. Robert did a fantastic job ferreting out like where did the harmonica stuff come from?
Mm.
Why the harmonica? Where's that all coming from? I'll let him fill you in a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look back at the Beatles' early career, the singles, the first year of singles, and how the harmonica was just a signature part of their early sound. Nearly formulaic, but they stopped short come the fourth single, but it was still on album tracks for a time. And doing the research, you find that the very aspect that made it compelling to British ears, it came in a year where there were two big hits that year in '62 that had these harmonica hooks. You had Hey Baby, Bruce Chanel, an American that became a hit record across Atlantic hit record, which was a rare thing, as well as I Remember You by Frank Ifield, this Australian crooner doing a World War II era song with that harmonica lick on it. And the Beatles apparently at one point when they're sort of sorting out, well, what's going to be our first original tune? What's going to be our record that we put out first? And they kind of land on Love Me Do, which has got that built-in harmonica motif. They wanted to be the first British act to have a hit record with a harmonica on it. And Frank Ifield kind of beat them to it by the time Love Me Do got released after a number of false takes. But it was that aspect that sort of fused this ear-catching hook as well as these sort of Everly Brothers harmonies that were so much a distinctive part of the Beatles sound that once they came back from the first Hamburg trip, they went there a bum group and they came back the Beatles in terms of, that Litherland Town Hall gig at the end of 1960 where they knock them dead. That the crowd is just mesmerized. They're not dancing, they're staring at them as they launch into Long Tall Sally. So, by every measure, that was the thing that just made them Beatles, that trip, however badly it ended. But anyway, so they've got these distinctive characteristics, their vocal sound, that harmonica hook. Capitol in America, who has the first right of refusal, when EMI shops that initial single to them, their harmonica is the thing that makes it a deal breaker for them. It's like, that's old hat. Nobody's interested in that in America, even though Hey Baby had just been a hit in America. It can't happen twice. It was their equivalent of guitar groups are on the way out. harmonica groups nobody wants to know.
There you go.
So that was their taking a pass, and it was to BJ's benefit for a short time.
There's the monochrome edition I'd like to talk about, and I'm curious about the Australian market, particularly with the book release. Can we talk about the two versions and the story behind those?
Sure. So we publish through Amazon, and so we're a bit at their whims of what they publish where, physically what they publish where. And unfortunately, there's some markets where, based on whatever your book format is, or your print specifications are, that they don't serve it. And one of them was our book, our color book was not able to be manufactured in Australia for whatever reason. And so because of that, and because we had interest everywhere for the book, we came up with the stopgap of, well, they'll publish it in black and white. So and the book looks terrific, actually, in grayscale black and white.
Yeah.
So at that point, the insider joke with Robert and I was, it was the monochrome version of the book as opposed to the stereo color version of the book.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's what it was. The books are identical outside of that, and again, it looks great, just like A Hard Day's Night looks great in black and white. The book looks great in black and white. So yeah, that was the germination of it. We just want people to be able to have it everywhere that we can get it in their hands.
Yeah,
we recognized
wonderful.
in telling the story we wanted to tell, which was to place the reader in John, Paul, George, and Ringo's footsteps in that period, that they lived in a world of color. They didn't live in black and white. And so the use of ephemera, the newspapers, the posters, record sleeves, magazine covers, all that stuff, we wanted to nail that point home to anybody picking up the book. It's like, okay, wow, this is what they saw on a regular basis, this record sleeve, this whatever in color. So that was very much factored into the concept of the book, is we got to place the readers into that world. Unfortunately, as Jerry indicated, we came up against this hurdle in that part of the world, which is like, the choice was either don't tell the story the way we want to tell it, which color is a big part of, or reluctantly make the mono version available so at least people can get the story, get the text. So it wasn't our call, but I'm glad that we're not neglecting an area of interest in the world.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I was reading recently that Mark Lewison has almost been working on his volumes in tandem because he's keenly aware of time and the load of work, that it's not about finishing one and moving to the other. You'll know better than I. I'm curious, we've got volume 1 here of something very special. Can I ask, and can you tell me, how far ahead do you see the road with what you've created?
Yeah,
I will say that in doing the research for this, that I'll at any number of stops along the way. For instance, as you look at the book, a lot of what we drew our visual ephemera from was a company in Dallas called Heritage Auctions. One of a kind stuff that we are free to use, just giving them credit in the book. And as I'm doing the research and pulling together stuff, it's like I'm coming up with stuff that does not fit our time frame for volume 1, but does for volume 2. So I'm setting aside folders on my computer. It's like, okay, got to use this, got to keep this. So I already have that pocket already is well underway and all down the line. The same thing with the online libraries, where we tapped into the periodicals of the era. Sometimes you go down a wormhole and it'll lead you to something from 1965 or something. Well, it's not going to work for this volume, but this is too good not to use. This will come up later as we work on the series. So Jerry can explain better than I what the timetable is, but yes, it's like you're doing the research, but necessarily the whole of the Beatles career will pop up as you're doing the research, and you just set aside what is going to fall outside the boundaries you impose upon yourself for what you're currently working on.
Yeah, like I've been all along collecting, because we're the scope of the scope of these books is different from the reference manuals that I did initially, which covered their core catalog, right? It covered the official releases of the core catalog of the Beatles, the core studio work. In these books, uh, anything that we find that they've recorded. So now you're talking about live at the BBC. Now you're talking about, in this particular book, we cover the Star Club recordings, and we talk about how those were made and how they were put down on tape. Um, uh, uh, the scope of this is way broader, to capture and identify uh, all of the recordings that fans might have access to, and that we're aware of. So uh, uh, I've been tracking, of course, all along tracking the current work on the anniversary editions, how those were put together, how Now and Then was put together, uh, all of that, and all of that just goes aside. You gather it, you put it aside for the time when it's going to come to assemble that information and make full sense of it. But we're as Robert said, as we're doing our work, we're always coming upon the whole of their career and pieces of the whole of their career. And so uh, those just get sorted out. And it was the same thing when I was doing the reference manuals. The that was like 11 years of work. And while I'm preparing this one for publication, there's stuff that's coming up, but bubbling up about books that are one or two books down the line that you just put in the back of your head, but you capture the information as best you can. So we've both always got these like running documents of notes that keep us organized. As to the schedule for these, we are working pretty diligently to have these out on a 12 to 18 month basis.
Wow.
That's the idea. They get this one because there was a lot of information that just wasn't there, that we really had to dig deep for. This one took a couple of years to flush out. The going forward, the challenge is in the level of detail that's going to come with the creation of the work, as opposed to the backstory of their initial history, which was the challenge with this one. As we tell the story of 63, again, we have to tell not only the story of the recordings that they were making at EMI, but everything we're finding in television performances and BBC radio performances and all of that. So on my end, and luckily I know a handful of people that can get me some good deep information about how the BBC work was configured. Because it happened at various different TV studios, radio studios throughout the UK, in France. There's stuff going on everywhere, and Sweden. So filling in, on my end, like the technical story of that, it's like I'm starting again in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So but it's fun.
Yeah.
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 It should be pointed out that you've covered what you covered in your reference manual series, but this is bigger in scope, because now we're going into the BBC, which is a bunch of different studios, radio broadcast Sweden. And one of the things that we did do in this first volume is everything that we were aware of, we would at least mention it if we hadn't heard it. For instance, the Jeff Emmerich tape, the tape that now is the subject of this legal battle that only surfaced after he died, that his heirs are trying to claim ownership of, and EMI, Universal, is pulling back on. Apparently, a studio recording from 62, apparently from the June 6th date with Pete Best. We haven't heard it. People apparently involved in the case may or may not have heard it, but there's speculation that it's actually the rest of the session that they did that day that only so far Pete Best Love Me Do and I think Best of Me Mucho, the only two things that have been made public, and that was an anthology. There are so many questions, and we lay this out in the book. It's like, well, how the hell did he get a hold of this if he's work didn't start at EMI till September? And by the way, if this tape was deemed unusable, why didn't they just wipe it like they did with any other tape? Yes. Why was it bin? So a lot of questions about that. We know of the existence of apparently a cavern gig in the summer of 62 with Pete Best, July of 62. I've never heard it, but it's been talked about. Wow. So there's that. There's the Hamburg 1960 recording of Summertime. We talk about this stuff even if we haven't heard it, just because we know it exists, and we're really hoping someday it may be found in some form, you know. And now, of course, as we mentioned earlier in this conversation, for the 1963 volume, stuff is popping up. So we have to talk about all that.
I'm a second generation fan, and I came into my love of the Beatles through books. And the first one was Nicholas Schaffner's Beatles Forever, which it was for a lot of second generation fans. What's been amazing as I've gotten older, I think particularly, and you both would know better than I, you've both been at the forefront of it. As we get more distance from the story, we seem to be able to recognize the true history and the value of moving away from that superficial kind of pulpy approach that for many years a variety of books could be said to have been. This seems to be a great, almost like a renaissance in Beatles authorship. Would you each agree? Because you each seem to be right up there at the tip of that. But you're not alone, are you?
This is a golden era of Beatles scholarship for sure. As Aaron Weber, who I've had on the show a number of times, has said, it's sort of the Goldilocks place in Beatles history, where you're far enough from the events to be able to see it with some critical distance, but close enough to it that there are still living witnesses and things that can still emerge. So Nicholas Schaffner, that was a wonderful book back when he wrote it, especially the richness of the illustrations and the presentation. Wonderful book. But the bar has been so raised on Beatles scholarship where it doesn't do anymore for people to quote from Lennon Remembers as if it is fact, right? So you've got access to a lot more data. You've got a lot more critical analysis going on of this stuff, and all for the greater good. For the greater good. So, we try to do that. Sometimes it's a tough pill for some people to swallow when you dare critique something rendered holy at this point. But it's what needs to happen if we're being honest about what we're doing. So there are things, if you've seen the Ribbons of Rust, where we are critical of either official narratives or Beatle performances. I don't, we're laying out a history, but there's enough subjectivity to where we feel it's within our brief. Well, if George played a lousy guitar solo at Decca, we should say so, shouldn't we?
Yes.
So, yeah.
If people were looking, sorry, please, Jerry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things that Robert and I have a kinship around is that we're not interested in telling stories that have already been told, and especially ones that have been told again and again and again. We really want to consistently add to the body of knowledge around the Beatles, and evaluate the information that's coming in with a critical eye. So it actually takes a bit to make the cut before we're going to include anything in the books. The information really has to prove itself. If it's information that is rumor or topic of conversation sort of stuff, and it warrants discussing it, we make it clear, the lack of validation if that's the situation. But our primary thing is we want people, reading these books not just to be getting a rehash of a dozen other Beatle books that are out, and there are Beatle books coming out every month, and of varying, of varying value. And it's never been our interest. It's to spend, because it's a lot of time to do these things.
Mm.
And it's not interesting, it's not fun, it's not valuable, it doesn't add anything just to rehash the stories. So the orientation of this book, the way that the context is revealed is something that we haven't seen. We're filling in blanks there. And then again, to expose as much of the recorded work as possible across distribution mediums is another thing that it hasn't been done in a holistic way. It hasn't been done in a unified way. And we're trying to do that too. And we think that makes these books, both unique and valuable.
Just as a for instance, I wouldn't make any kind of grandiose claim that you're going to read something in this book that's going to make you rethink everything forever. This is huge. A lot of people make the mistake of overstating things. I think maybe it's the insights we come up with along the way that somebody else has never commented on before. Like, for instance, I've never seen anybody point out the pattern that at every juncture from day one where the Beatles were putting their music down on tape, they always included an original tune that they had written. The only time they didn't was when Alan Williams wouldn't pay for it when they were recording Summertime in October 1960. And that was on him, not for their lack of desire. They wanted it. Even Bert Camford records Cry for a Shadow, right?
Yeah.
And then of Decca, you got 3 originals, and In Spite of All the Danger and Fortland Road. Their whole recording history is just littered in pre-MI days with original tunes that they obviously, it was very important for them to put on tape. But one of the things that we came across in the researching of this book, it's another one of these, thank God somebody had the presence of mind enough to document this fleeting thing that happened and then it was gone forever. It was a TV appearance they did in October of 1962. They're in promoting Love Me Do mode. And, there's no Betamax, there's no VHS. TV broadcast happens live. You're at the mercy of the broadcaster preserving that tape or not. And more often than not, even the BBC, they did not. Even after the Beatles sold millions of records, we're going to wipe these tapes. Anyway, somebody hotwires their TV, meaning they run a tape recorder off one of the speaker leads or something like that, where they're very much at risk of electrocuting themselves as you're doing this to preserve the sound of the Beatles' performance, of them doing, I think, this particular occasion, it was Love Me Do and some other guy, something like that. So ever since 1995, and Anthology 1 came out, Pete Best was roundly crucified for his June 6, 1962 performance of Love Me Do, where suddenly it's like he has an aneurysm or something in the middle of the song and starts playing this different beat. And like, what is this? No wonder they got rid of him. Well, September, the Beatles record with Ringo and then Andy White, Love Me Do. You know that version very well. It's in all our DNA. So here's this a month and a half later on TV promoting that record. Ringo does exactly the same thing Pete Best did.
Wow.
What do we draw from that? That was their live arrangement. He was just doing the way they'd architected that song for a live performance as opposed to a studio recording hit record. So little insights like that. Pete, you're off the hook now. You can retire.
Yeah. But as you say, it's probably less about revelations and more about richness and depth. And it's already such a wonderful story, but there's an opportunity here to add layers of richness. You've said a few things there that I wasn't even aware of that immediately do that.
Well, there's another one related.
Yeah, interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another one related to Pete in relation to the Camford recordings in Germany. Mark Lewison tells the story that, or interprets the story that he wasn't a good enough drummer, so Camford holds back part of his drum kit, doesn't let him play the full kit. He's only allowed to play the snare, right? Can't do the kick and snare. Well, okay, that's one interpretation. But now if you listen to Camford's hits leading up to that, listen to Wonderland by Night, right? And you learn that there's no kick drum in any of those. He uses the bass guitar and that is, and the transient plucking of the bass guitar as the kick element in his arrangements. So it isn't that Pete was, was being handcuffed because he was a crap drummer. This was what the producer wanted on his records. And again, unless you're willing to get into the Camphor catalog and listen to that stuff, you're going to believe that he was a crap drummer.
Yeah.
And he was no Ringo, but that was I think a bit of an unfair assessment of his abilities.
What an opportunity here for history to be kinder to the legacy of Pete Best.
Yeah.
Gents, where would people go to find Ribbons of Rust? I know there's a website. Can we talk to that? And then, of course, there's Amazon. Could you share the best place to go?
Well, if you go to ribbonsofrust.net, we couldn't get .com, although the guy who does have that is wondering where this big spike of traffic came from. You have a nice sampler inside the book. So if you're interested in this, if you've heard this conversation, you want to find out more, you're just intrigued and don't want to pull the trigger just yet, go to ribbonsofrust.net and you can breeze through. I think there's 20 pages we put up there so people can know exactly what we're talking about. The color, the QRs, the text, and Jerry's wonderful charts depicting the way these things were recorded and what the instruments were, all that stuff. Everything that is knowable, he put in there, and that's the way we approached it. So that would be a good way. And then you can link through to Amazon from our site. You can go direct to whatever country you're in, go to Amazon. And if you're in the Pacific countries, you've got that wonderful monochrome edition.
There's a wonderful trailer there too. I happened to catch. I thought it was a beautifully edited piece that tells a story. I hadn't seen a trailer for a book before. I thought that was a great one. Gents, I was talking with Joe Wisby, who's probably no stranger to you, from the Beatles Books podcast, a lovely man, and we got talking in depth about the story, and he was talking about particular books that resonated with him, and he was saying that, to paraphrase him, that the thing about the Beatles story is they're great weeds. Once you get into the weeds, they're good weeds to explore. There are other acts and other stories that the weeds aren't as rich, but when you dive into the Beatles story, they're good weeds. And I think what you're doing here is a continuation of that idea of going in and finally moving through those weeds and making these revelations come to life. It's, for fans, it's the Lord's work. So very grateful for both of you to continue to be out there, and very excited about what's coming down the road. And thank you for taking time to sit with me today and share some of that here on You Can Talk to Me.
That's very kind. Thank you for saying that. And I think Jerry would agree that unless there was some compelling thing to ponder and interpret that you were finding in the weeds, there would be no point to doing this. But it's like every time you think you've heard it all or learned it all or read it all, you go down into those weeds, man, you're going to come up with some gems. And it's like, this is bottomless. It's never ending.
Yeah. One of the great stories of all time. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mike.
Appreciate it.